branding. Okay, so our next speaker is me. I'm going to be presenting my talk called Opacity and Responsibility. This is a bit of a sequel to the talk I gave in March's symposium, so I'll try to recap things as quickly as I can so we can get up to speed, and then we'll see how essentially the next development of the thought after that, right? So a couple of ethical preliminaries to talk about. So essentially, because I'm gonna have to make sure I stay, I tend to wander when I talk, so I'm gonna have to make sure I don't do that. Okay, so when it comes to the idea of opaque algorithms, right, there's a concern about how much we should trust in these kinds of things, right? And so to start with, I'll cover a few ethical preliminaries, right? So the first is, it comes from Clifford's Ethics of Belief and his evidentialist principle that it's wrong for people to believe things on insufficient evidence, right? And to kind of explain where this intuition comes from, he provides the story of a ship owner in around the 19th century. So they many passenger ships are bringing people across the ocean, and so you have a ship owner who sort of sees that their ship is in sort of a dilapidated state. It may not be the most seaworthy, and so there's a concern about whether it might make it. And the ship owner decides to essentially convince themselves that the ship actually is seaworthy by sort of stifling their doubts. They sort of say, well, the ship's made it many times before in the past, despite how it looks, and maybe we'll just trust in God's providence, right, and that the ship will make it, right? And lo and behold, the ship sinks, right? And the ship owner is happy to collect on the insurance money in that eventuality, right? And so one of the important things to keep in mind about a story like this is that Clifford points out that the ship owner has done something morally wrong because they formed a belief that the ship was safe when they had no right to believe that kind of thing, right? So that's a concern. And it's a concern because, again, our beliefs are things that can store up within us. They dispose us to do certain kinds of things. And so if we believe things for poor reasons, they become kind of landmines, right? We could step on them at any moment and they could go off, right? And so that could be a real problem. And another thing to consider is, again, if the ship made it, we would still say that the ship owner did something wrong, right? So even if the ship does actually make it at the end of the day, we'd still say that they had no right to believe what they had to believe, right? So the next preliminary to think about is the idea of inductive risk. And so this comes from a number of different philosophers. However, I'll mostly talk about Heather Douglas's treatment of the concept. But basically it asks us to consider what is the sufficiency of evidence given the possibility that whatever conclusion you come to, you could be wrong about that, right? So should you demand a higher standard of evidence, or should you demand a lower standard of evidence? For example, if you're more concerned about a false positive, maybe you might ask for a higher standard of evidence because the moral risks of a false positive might be very high, so you want to make sure you increase your standard, right? Or maybe if you're more open to the idea of false negatives, maybe you would adopt, or you're more concerned about that, you would adopt a lower standard of evidence, right? So basically the ethics involves this question of what is the sufficiency of evidence given the possibility that I'm wrong. And Douglas, for example, explains this intuition that this applies to basically everybody. We're responsible for considering the possibility that we might be wrong about what we might conclude and consider the sufficiency of evidence for this. And this is done on the basis that the ordinary sort of expectation that we not be reckless or negligent about how we do things, right? We sort of police each other and expect that, if you aren't fully considering the risks, you shouldn't proceed, right? So these are some of the ethical preliminaries. And so when we start talking about things like machine learning, right, we have to consider, for example, if you have a model that really depends on something like credit ratings, and credit ratings are known to have about a 30% error rate, then what does that say about the reliability of that data, given the possibility that someone might be wrong, right? So is this a reliable piece of data to use in a particular model, right? But then on top of that, we might ask, well, what about the model itself? The model itself can also generate false positives and false negatives, and this is something that we should be concerned about. So for example, we were talking about this yesterday, the idea of using AI detectors to detect if a student has used ChatGPT. And in this situation, just get rid of that box. In this situation, they note that, for example, there's only about a 2% error rate in these algorithms, right? But think about that, 2%, that's a lot of students, right, who are now going to be accused of being cheaters and have almost no way of defending themselves, right? So that's a big concern. McDonald's, right? Their AI ordering algorithm is about 85% accurate. So that means about 15% are going to get the wrong McDonald's orders. Terrible, terrible things. Right? Consider the sufficiency of evidence before you get errors like that. So if an AI developer can't predict the consequences of a model owing to the opacity involved in the sort of black box, how can they mitigate some of these inductive risk concerns? So there's a philosopher named Kare Karaka who has addressed some of these issues. He draws attention to the distinction between training error and test error. So whereas training error is the amount of error that you encounter while you're building the model, test error is the amount of error that you get once you've completed the model, you're testing it on new data, right? So his point is that we can focus on inductive risk by paying attention to training error. We might decide to have cost-insensitive machine learning, which maximizes predictive accuracy, or if we're concerned that maybe this isn't very reliable, right, we might decide to adjust our cost function to assign different kinds of costs for different kinds of errors and introduce cost-sensitive machine learning, right? So he gives the example of a bank who might, if they're feeling particularly more risky, they might be okay with the idea of false positives if they're evaluating a potential loan, person to loan something out. Whereas on the other hand, if they're more risk adverse, maybe they would be more happier with things like false negatives, right? So you can build in different kinds of concerns to try to make the thing more responsive to inductive risk concerns. In fact, in the case of, again, AI detectors, Turnitin noted that they intentionally oversampled students who are English as a second language, specifically because they were concerned that the ESL students would be more likely to be flagged for producing AI-generated content. So they oversampled these people to try to counter that risk, right? But there's an additional problem that comes up with these concerns. And it has to do again with this issue of the black box, right? So, according to the idea of opacity of neural networks, right? We have a situation where we know the kinds of inputs that we put into a model, we know the kinds of outputs that we get from the model, but we don't necessarily know how the model is translating those inputs into outputs. We don't necessarily know what it's picking up on in order to derive a conclusion. And so oftentimes the thing that we would like would be some kind of level of interpretability to be able to explain and predict what the model is going to do. But there's an additional problem that can come up when you're dealing with opacity, and it has to do with the idea that algorithms can sometimes rely on spurious correlations that don't really make a lot of sense. So for example, Cairns and Roth in their book, they point out that you could, for example, build a book purchase prediction algorithm using a completely randomized data set, and at the end of the day, you could still end up with a model that is still 100% accurate. Right, and would generate you completely accurate predictions about whether someone was likely to purchase or not purchase a book, even though we know that all the input data is randomized, right? And so there's lots of other examples. So for example, some algorithms, if they're trying to predict whether something is a wolf or a husky, right? More often than not, it can get pretty accurate, right? But in some cases, they've been able to try to explain what the model was looking at in order to make these predictions, right? And they found out that in the case of wolves and huskies, right, it was predicting that something is a wolf based on whether there's snow in the background, right? All the pictures that had been taken of huskies featured huskies sort of, like dogs against like concrete and grass and stuff like that. The wolves tended to be pictured against snow. So the algorithm said, oh, snow, wolf, right? So that can be problematic. There's another case involving explanation of an algorithm that was trying to determine if a text is about Christianity or atheism, and the results that it gave up was that if something was atheistic, if it contained the words posting, host, and read. Right. So it can potentially make very accurate predictions based off of things that seem very spurious and not really very reliable correlations, right? Because you can think about even the idea that maybe the number of odd letters in your last name would correlate positively or negatively with a purchase or a not purchase, right? But the question is, how reliable are any of those correlations for making long-term predictions, right? So you think about this in the case of algorithms in medicine, right? There were cases of algorithms that were learning to detect cancer based on whether a ruler was present in the image. Again, rulers were present in all the training images. And that this thing was able to reach a level of accuracy comparable to human dermatologists, right? So I gave the example in my book about, you could have a situation, imagine, where coincidentally, the practice that might produce a slide that might be used in, a biological, sample slide. There might be a process, an artifact that gets created in the manufacture of that slide that might be coincidentally present every time something is cancer and not when it isn't cancer, right? And it could be tiny, it could be the size of a pixel, the kind of thing that you would never notice, right? But if the algorithm picks up on that, then it might start saying, oh, every time there's this artifact, then it means that there's cancer, right? But the problem is we don't know that it's picking up on that, right? And so then what happens if, again, it seems like it's very reliable, it seems predictably accurate, comparable to humans, right? So you say, well, it's a good model, let's put it into production, right? Then we change the process at one point down the road of how we manufacture these slides, and the artifact disappears. We don't know about that, right? So what's going to happen? It's going to start probably predicting things wrongly, right? So the point is that even though you might have something that even when you're trying to look at test error, right, it still might seem very accurate, right? So even once after the point you put this thing into practice, it might seem like it's accurately making predictions, right? And so the thing is, the problem is that it would be making errors and you never even know about it, right? So this is a problem because of the opacity involved with these things. First of all, you don't know the patterns. You don't know what correlations it's necessarily looking for. And because of that, it makes it difficult to say whether those correlations are reliable and something that we should trust, right? It should be, or rely on. Should we rely on those things, right? But also, again, it's not just about whether those correlations make sense, but again, if for example, let's say credit rating plays a huge role in terms of what this model is producing, and you're not fully aware of that, and these credit ratings are subject to a 30% error rate, again, how do you say whether it makes sense to use this data in your model, right? How can you mitigate those inductive risk concerns, right? So there's lots of ways that you can try to explain these models. There's things like LIME, there's things like input heat maps, but they're problematic for a lot of reasons. First of all, a lot of them involve their own inductive risk concerns. So really, even if you're trying to explain the model, you're adding inductive risk to inductive risk. Like, should you trust the explanation, right? But also, even when you try to get to explain sometimes what it's relying on, sometimes even that can be ambiguous, right? So in this case, we see evidence of what an algorithm might rely on to predict whether an animal is a Siberian husky, right? And also what it might rely on to predict whether the image is a transverse flute. So again, that's a problem, right? And I'll go back briefly too. Even things like there was an algorithm that was designed to detect what an object was, and in many cases they were using a fish, right? And it was saying yes, it was a fish. And how was it predicting a fish? Fingers, people's fingers, right? Because all of the training images featured people holding up the fish to the camera, right? So given all these things and given the opacity, you might say, well, how can anyone mitigate any inductive risk concerns, right? And of course, you might say, well, this is just overfitting, right? You just need more diverse data, right? If you didn't have If you had more images of the fish that didn't have fingers, then you wouldn't have that problem. If you had images of huskies that were against different kinds of backgrounds, then you wouldn't have that problem, right? So you just need to make sure your data is more diverse, right? But that's the problem. Because of opacity, you have no idea how diverse your data needs to be because you have no idea how it's using the data as evidence in the first place, right? So because of that, you can't be sure that you're overfitting in the sense that your test or training data is relevantly different enough or representative enough to detect the error, right? So again, going back to the situation involving the artifact in the slide, right? If we're not aware of that artifact, and we're not aware that it's picking up on that artifact, and we use that as test data too, that's just going to further confirm, yes, it's getting it right, but for the wrong reasons, right? So if it's getting it right for the wrong reasons, then that's a big problem, right? It kind of raises a whole web of different epistemic issues, right? So if you don't know how the data is being used, you can't know for certain whether your test data or training data will contain spurious correlations. The test data will not reliably test a model unless the data is relevantly different, i.e. reflects the world and doesn't contain those kinds of spurious issues. You know, it has to be relevantly different from the training data if you're going to catch those kinds of spurious correlations, right? So a model might test well even if it's actually performing very poorly. And at any point, the data could change in ways, you know, those artifacts, those spurious correlations could change in ways that you didn't know and didn't anticipate because you don't even know the model's picking up on it in the first place, right? So in many ways, this is kind of similar to a very old epistemic problem in philosophy, which is Nelson Goodman's new riddle of induction, right? So in the new riddle of induction, he defines a couple of sort of strange predicates, like GRU, right? So GRU is defined as all objects that are green prior to a certain arbitrary point in the future, right? And then afterwards they're blue, right? Whereas BLEAN are all objects that are blue before a certain arbitrary date in the future, and after that they become green, right? The problem for us is that from our perspective, before this arbitrary date, we have as much evidence for the fact that all blue things are BLEAN as we do that they're blue, right? We have no way of knowing that one day something could change and all of our empirical generalizations go out the window, right? So in many ways, this is very similar to the idea of AI. In fact, I would call this potentially, the new AI riddle of induction, right? So if you imagine, for example, again, something like an algorithm that's picking up on whether something is predicting whether it's cancer based on whether this artifact is there or not, right? Before a certain arbitrary date and time, right, it's going to predict correctly that it's cancer, and then after it's not going to do that, right? But because of opacity, first of all, you know, prior to that date, this is going to look accurate, right? But then on top of that, we don't even know that it's picking up on that artifact at all. So you don't know how it's making the conclusions that it is, right? And so that's a problem, right? And then if we think about this further, right, there's an issue because, this is the number, right? Okay. So we might ask ourselves then, well, if this is the case, right, if it's not really feasible to mitigate inductive risk concerns because you don't know how the data is being used in evidence, you can't speak to the sufficiency of those evidence given the consequences of being wrong, right, should we just sort of say, well, this is negligence, right? I don't know, right? Interestingly enough, right, like Douglas, she notes that, you know, we're talking about negligence. This is a communal thing. We hold each other, we police each other for negligence. There's no, you know, there isn't necessarily a perfect standard that is pre-existent, right? This is something that we're going to have to police each other on, right? And so the question might be, well, are there different levels or different standards of negligence that might apply in any of these cases, right? So there's something like the reasonable person standard, right? Would a reasonable person allow a tool that can make, you know, millions of predictions, in a minute or in a week or whatever, right? to act in that way, right? Is it a reasonable, would a reasonable person act in that way, right? What would a reasonable person do given how little they know about how their model might be working relative to all the potential consequences? What would a reasonable person do in that case, right? I don't know. Maybe a reasonable person would say you shouldn't do that at all, especially if you can't mitigate those things, right? But as we're talking about, right, it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle, right? So maybe we might have to change our expectations about what reasonable standards are and what a reasonable person might do when they're creating an AI algorithm that they can't fully predict, right? There's also standards like the duty of care, right? You might be negligent if you have a duty of care. Usually applies in things like medicine, right? Where there's this expectation of things like, again, a duty of care, informed consent, right? Which you don't get when you're talking about AI, right? That's the AI industry is just not built on those foundations of having fiduciary responsibility, having some concern about informed consent or any of those issues, right? Foreseeability, right? Is that a standard, right? You're negligent if there was something that was foreseeable, right? How? But if you don't know how the model is picking up on evidence, how can anything be foreseeable, right? That's a tricky one. Proximate cause is the connection to remote from the person who is affected, right? And I think that's an interesting one because I suspect that if there was one standard of negligence that a lot of these AI companies will want, it might be something like proximate cause, right? Because if the AI developer is so far removed from the student who gets accused of cheating, how can that student turn around and say, well, the AI developer's done this to me, I want to sue them, right? And they might say, well, there's too many degrees of separation there, right? So we can't hold that person accountable, right? There's also comparative negligence, which focuses on whether the distribution of sort of fault between the plaintiff and the defendant. Again, I'm not sure in a case like this whether it makes sense to apply that kind of standard unless we're willing to say that you're just as negligent for using the AI as the AI developer is for making it. It's kind of would be a strange standard, right? There's something like contributive negligence, right? So is the plaintiff even slightly at fault, right? That might be a standard. Gross negligence, severe disregard, high level of recklessness, right? Is this stuff a high level of recklessness? Right? I mean, in many ways it might seem like that, but again, if we're prepared to just sort of say, well, we like these things, maybe we are prepared to accept that maybe a reasonable person can sometimes act very negligently. Right? And it's important to keep in mind the fact that different people, different stakeholders might have different expectations when it comes to standards of negligence and how we might expect to hold different people accountable. Right? Another issue too, so if you have an issue where, so oftentimes if we can't talk about how a model, if we can't interpret it, we can at least say, well, the model gets it right 80% of the time, and that might be better than a human, right? Would you rather trust a self-driving car that gets it right 80% of the time, or a human who gets it right 70% of the time, right? That kind of thing. But there's a problem where if you can only really rely on the idea of statistical validation, then, and this is going to tell you that the thing is getting it right, because these aren't going to be caught as false positives, right? If it's getting the right answer but for the wrong reason, it's not going to catch as a false positive or a false negative, right? And so then the question becomes, well, if this is your only standard for evaluating the reliability of that algorithm, then how is that anything other than confirmation bias, really? I mean, it's not a reliable metric, and it's your only metric that you have, right? So again, we might just sort of say, well, the algorithm's got it right many times in the past, right? Like familiar reasoning, right? So we might be just like the ship owner saying, well, the ship's made it many times in the past, so maybe that's a good enough standard. I don't know, right? So one of the questions we might ask ourselves is this just a completely new, unprecedented level of risk that we are prepared to accept? That there's a whole new kind of person, the AI developer, who we are going to grant license to act in ways that we would consider horribly negligent most of the time, But for these people, we'll be like, well, maybe not much, maybe not so bad, right? Like maybe we're prepared to say that that stuff's okay, right? I'm gonna say that. And so, some people might argue, and some people put the argument that we shouldn't be using these kinds of opaque algorithms, right? But again, how likely is it that we're actually going to be able to get people to realize this and to not make and say, oh yes, these things are not reliable. We shouldn't use opaque algorithms, right? And there's a cost because if you try to make it more interpretable, oftentimes it's less accurate, right? So maybe we just like all this stuff, right? Maybe we like the fact that we have all the efficiency that comes with AI, right? Sometimes we even like the idea, we might even expect that AI is supposed to pick up on hidden patterns that we don't detect, right? Isn't that supposed to be part of the selling points of the way? And the fact that oftentimes they make these sort of shiny objects that are very popular with the public, right? So maybe, again, if negligence is about how the community is willing to police each other, are we willing to just sort of say, well, we really like this stuff so much that we're prepared to just sort of say, well, we're not going to hold you as accountable in terms of negligence as we do anyone else, because we just really, really like this stuff that much, right? In which case, we sort of end up in a situation where, as one AI president put it, right, you're just going to have to trust that a bunch of smart people have determined that this is the smart way to do it. So we might ask ourselves, maybe I'm being a bit too nitpicky. For example, you might say, well, what's the inductive risk of every bolt, every piece, every object in this building that it could potentially fail, right? Like if you break things down enough, everything could seem potentially risky, right? The problem is that I can explain how this building works. I can explain how all the parts fit together. I might even be able to trace back to the QC and the company and the day that each part was made, right? So there is accountability there, right? Or maybe we might say, well, this is just how science has always worked, right? It's always been kind of, basing on these sort of risky generalizations that we might end up turning out to be wrong, right? Maybe, but the concern is the fact that now basically anybody can do this stuff at large scale, right? So oftentimes, again, the very distinctive problem with using AI in this way is not necessarily that it's a new issue, it's just the fact that we can now do it on a much larger scale. So the amount of harm becomes magnified, right? And so again, we might say, well, maybe that's something that we're prepared to accept, right? Maybe we will say that, for the sake of innovation and efficiency and all this stuff, maybe all this negligence is worth it, right? This guy's here, so.
Yes.
That's it.